The title of this forum, this workshop, is Closing the Black Home Ownership Gap and I want to emphasize, and creating generational wealth. We don't have that much time to really flush out and drill out everything that this topic involves. So one of the things I did was send some questions ahead of time to the panelists, and I'll reiterate those questions and open it up. The first question that I asked was, Black and Latinx home ownership rates remain significantly lower than for whites who are not Latinx. Black home ownership rates in Boston, for example, 29.6%, Latinx, 16.5%, whites who are not Latinx, 44.5%. So I'd like to ask you, just very briefly, and you can talk about some of your own work so people get to know what you're doing, just very briefly, what are some of the contemporary factors? We know what the historical factors are, but what are some factors that we are dealing with today that explain this gap? And part of this question is why the concern? You know, why is this an important question? And I'll just call on people, or people volunteer. Let me go on Elliot, since his box is right next to mine. And I'll go around. I'll just go around.
Sure, thank you, James. Thank you, CHAPA. I really appreciate the invite. I'm happy to be here. I think there's several reasons why this is so important, why closing the racial homeownership gap and the wealth gaps are important. It starts with intergenerational wealth, right? We all know that homeownership is a key driver of wealth accumulation for American households, but it doesn't stop there. It trickles down into all kinds of other factors. Lack of wealth is going to oftentimes mean higher levels of debt. Higher debt's going to lead to lower credit scores. If one has a lower credit score, they might have difficulty obtaining reasonably affordable student loans. And so it's pervasive. It's a vicious cycle that I think that we need to combat from all kinds of different angles. And homeownership is just a piece of that cycle. In terms of contemporary factors, I mean, I think that there's historical context for nearly every factor here, but reading through the most recent mortgage lending report that MCBC and the UMass Donahue Center put together, it states that the most common reasons for denial among Black and Latinx households for mortgage loans pertains around debt to income and credit scores. So I think that addressing income and debt, getting upstream and helping to prepare households for the point at which they might become eligible for homeownership is equally as important as addressing homeownership at that point in time.
Okay. And I'm just going around the boxes near me. Leslie?
Hello, thank you. My name is Leslie Reid. I work for Madison Park Development Corporation. Our mission is to foster a vibrant, healthy Roxbury neighborhood that supports the well-being and advancement of the community. You know, we are hard pressed to serve our mission of advancement in the community when our residents are historically been locked out of the single largest asset and wealth building opportunity, which is absolutely essential wealth and assets to stable families and communities. Let's face it, you can have a great education, a ton of student debt, a high paying job, but if you don't have net worth, savings, or assets, you're an illness, a paycheck, a heartbeat away from the loss of your housing, your childcare, your healthcare, in essence, your stability and security, which is why asset building and intergenerational wealth is so important to our mission and important to the residents of our community. You know, our neighborhood is also more vulnerable to involuntary displacement resulting from rising rents and home prices. And what that does is it not just destabilizes individuals, but also, you know, destabilizes the institutions and cultural assets that contribute to healthy communities. Our schools, our churches, our nonprofits, our social clubs are destabilized when displacement makes our population transient. So for those reasons, it is certainly a really critical issue to a healthy community like Roxbury, which has traditionally been the heart of the Black community in Boston. And when you talk about contemporary challenges, I just want to share with you something, which is the cost of land and real estate. The average cost of a home in Roxbury, depending on who you ask, is $500,000 to $600,000. That results in a monthly housing payment of $3,000 per month, $36,000 per year, $120,000 a year, or almost $60 an hour is what you have to earn to own a home, regardless of past discrimination. And this is inaccessible to working people of color because, let's be honest, wages and job opportunities haven't kept pace with the commodification of housing that's really resulted from the lack of equitable regulation. So, for example, the removal of rent control and the challenges of implementing cost-effective multifamily development continue to contribute to really, really high barriers to equitable access to home ownership and wealth building for our community.
Chrystal?
Thank you, Dr. Jennings. Good to see you. Thank you, CHAPA and fellow panelists for having this conversation, letting me join this conversation with you all. I tend to like to think about things as contemporary opportunities as opposed to challenges. I agree with everything that previous panelists have said, and I know I'm going to agree with everything Henry's going to say as well. I do want to say that because of the real estate market, particularly in Greater Boston being as strong as it is, and as we look at demographics of populations and what first-time home buyers are going to be and look like over the next 10 to 15 years, I see the opportunity as one in which we get to grow our GDP. And if we're not focusing on home buyers of color, I mean, it's great social justice reason, there are all these things, but if we're not focusing on home buyers of color, then we are really missing out on huge opportunities to grow our economies, both at the local level. Homeownership contributes at a different level to local tax revenue. Tax revenue drives investments in public schools, drives investments in other kinds of infrastructure that contribute to a higher quality of life. If we're not focusing on these things, then we're missing out on the opportunity to have those investments as well. And we can no longer afford to let historical racist practices sort of get in the way of, good old American capitalism. And so let's sort of think about what that means and how we can all benefit from that.
Henry?
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Jennings, and thanks to CHAPA for inviting me to this, and thanks to the other panelists for being willing to share your time with me as well. I think the reason I do a lot of things, but I think the reason I'm here is I'm doing some work with Opportunities communities and Nuestra Comunidad and MAHA on an affordable home ownership project in Roxbury that is directed at trying to close the racial wealth gap in an affordable home ownership program, with the idea of specifically targeting the home ownership opportunities to people of color. And this is kind of piggybacking on some things that Chrystal and Leslie are doing at the state level, borrowing from some of their ideas about how to address equity recapture and appreciation recapture requirements and affordable housing programs. But I think what we're trying to do is build on that by making it very explicit. We are trying to address persistent conditions of discrimination focused on people of color in Roxbury. And so to that extent, I think it's hard for us to separate the historical situation from the present day situation. If you go, and I think everybody knows the history, the way that the the Federal Housing Administration mortgage insurance homeowner subsidies were directed only at white households over the course of nearly 50 years, to the exclusion of particularly Black households and Black borrowers. I think people are familiar with the practice of predatory lending that takes place in places like Roxbury and other communities of color that has the effect of extracting value from both Black families and Black communities, and permitting profits really to sort of white profit takers, if you will. And so those are the kind of conditions that we want, that we are really trying to address here. And I agree with everything about all the other panelists said about why it's important to do this work now. Generational, home ownership really has sparked in the United States generational transfer of wealth. And that's why the history is so important. It's not just present day accumulation of wealth. It really is the generational transfer, primarily through the transfer of wealth accumulated in the past by homeownership, through homeownership, from which people of color have been excluded. And that's what we want to reverse. And the other comments that were made about how that asset accumulation opens up other opportunities is also really crucial. People sending their kids to college based on equity that they take out of their house and other kinds of things. And so I'll stop here and without having to repeat everything everybody else said, but I think for me anyway, the present day conditions that our project is seeking to address are directly linked to historical practices and the historical conditions as well.
Okay. So I want to come back to something that, and James, by the way, what Chrystal mentioned, and Leslie, you also touched upon this a little bit. We all agree that Black home ownership is a critical tool for creating intergenerational wealth. And Elliot, you laid out how that gets played out, all of you did. But if Black home ownership is not a panacea, but part of something that has to take place, could you just give a little bit of light on what some of those other things are? So we're not just about increasing Black home ownerships, we're also about something else that goes along with building greater rates of Black home ownership. And some of you touched upon that, so if you can amplify that a little bit. Well, I'll go to, I mentioned Chrystal first, so I'll go to Chrystal first. So what else should we be doing around a strategy to build Black home ownership outside of people owning homes?
Outside of people owning homes, I guess I'm a little confused because Black home ownership means that Black people own homes. And
Right.
so outside of that, what are we going to do to get ourselves and our economy prepared for an increase in Black home ownership rates? Elliot talked about credit and how we think about credit and how that gets underwritten. And how people access mortgages. We have to think differently around that. And again, I'm talking about this in terms of, we don't want to create a system in which just because you're Black, you get a mortgage, although I'm all about the Black people mortgage. We also want we want a system that can take a little more risk than is what we consider conventional. That's number one. And the other thing I will say, I'll leave room for other people to talk about, is like, we've got to just build more homes.
Okay.
There's some level in which we can, say we're going to have 10,000 more people of color buy homes. Well, we need more homes for them to actually purchase. And so there's a supply side situation to that. As Simone talked about previously, there's also how, like, if you're a even if you're a wage earner in your family and you have a kind of significant wage, what one would consider a significant wage, what may be typical is that in Black families and Latinx families, you're using that wage to support other folks in your family. You don't have the bank of mom and dad. You actually are the bank of mom and dad to others. And so thinking about down payment assistance programs coupled with the idea of, mortgage write-downs and how we structure these things, are, if that's what you mean, those are the things.
Yeah, that's part of what I mean, but maybe I can be a little bit more clear. Leslie mentioned some of the obstacles to actually owning a home. That takes money, that takes certain jobs. So are workforce development programs also part of a strategy to increase Black home ownership? What about entrepreneurship, especially youth entrepreneurship in our public schools? Does that become part of the umbrella of 5-10 years from now, seeing a big bump in Black home ownership rates? Leslie?
Yeah, thank you for that. A lot of times when we talk about homeownership, our peers and colleagues will go to that issue that I touched on, which is the commodification of housing. Where in our country, we've created this system where the roof over your head is also your single largest asset. And that's problematic. I'll acknowledge it. And right now, it's the best way to build assets. So until we get reparations, right, I think we have to embrace this strategy when it comes to wealth and asset building. So that said, I'm really excited because we're starting to see a lot more conversation about reparative policies outside of homeownership, although I think there are still more reparative homeownership policies. But I start getting really excited where in Stockton, California, they're talking about universal incomes. In Evanston, Illinois, racial housing reparations. Here in Massachusetts, there's some talk about baby bonds. And we've seen just alone with some of the financial stimulus packages that have come out of COVID that you can give people money and not tell them what to do with it, right? Like, we can do this. We need to do this, right? To me, that's reparative, right? That's addressing the past wrong. And so I think this is an exciting moment where I'm seeing more practical applications of those kinds of strategies than I ever would have dreamed I would see in my professional lifetime.
I agree absolutely with what Leslie is describing. I do want to remind everyone that we had very race-conscious policies that helped build a middle class of white folks in FHA. And so when we start with this thing where we're just like, what about all these other things? I'm just like, no. Pay attention to what we're talking about. We're talking about Black home ownership. And we have to not get, we got to do all that other stuff too, but let's not do all that other stuff in the name of home ownership. We can do all that other stuff in the name of wealth building. And home ownership is a tool under the wealth building umbrella, not workforce development as a tool under the home ownership umbrella, right? And so let's not mix these two things, because if we do, then we get ourselves to a place in which we make these kinds of investments and we don't necessarily move the needle at the same pace. And then because we, like, a lot of this stuff is political, like, people will look back and be like, oh, we tried and nothing happened. It's like, no, we need generations worth of investments around things. And we can move the needle around home ownership without necessarily saying, well, we got to start way, way back with education and universal childcare and It's like, no, we need to build some more houses and get the Black people loan and get Black people in homes.
Okay. Elliot, and then, I'm sorry, Henry, and then Elliot.
So I'm going to try to stand in the middle between Leslie and Chrystal. Not get in between them, just stand in the middle. Because, we've heard from lots of other people today, there is a huge amount of work to do to achieve racial equity. And that work is generational, right? That work has been going on for generations. And it's work that all of us on the panel and all of the other speakers and most of the people who are attending today have engaged in one way or the other throughout their lifetimes, and we won't be done. And there's plenty of work to do, and there are plenty of ways to do it. But if what we are talking about is the vehicle that created white generational wealth in the United States, it is home ownership, as Chrystal points out. And Chrystal is also absolutely right that for generations, for decades, our federal government, our state government, our local programs all supplied homeowner subsidy in the form of federal mortgage insurance and other kinds of programs to white people, and people of color got what some people would call, as part of the dual housing market, a second tier of rental housing, typically subsidized rental housing in highly racially identified concentrated locations. And you can map that in Boston, and you can map that in lots of other cities in Massachusetts and across the country. And so if what we want to do is address that question of what was the main tool for building white wealth, let's use home ownership as a tool for building Black wealth. And let's do it the same way that the government did it for white people, and provide the same level of subsidy that was provided to those white households all of those years. I mean, to me, it's not a question of, you can call it reparations. I'm a lawyer, so I call it a remedy for an unconstitutional civil rights violation. That's what I think it is. So,
Elliot, did you want to say something?
Not much to add. I agree with everything that's been said. It's pretty comprehensive. I agree with the baby bonds. That was what I was going to mention as a potential alternative strategy. Student loan debt, I think we can't ignore that. So many young people, particularly young people of color, disproportionately impacted by high levels. High levels hardly does it justice. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases of student loan debt that just serves as an anchor that's going to prohibit them from entering the home ownership market. And I think investing in education in a myriad of different ways, but one of those being to reduce or eliminate as much student loan debt as possible for young homebuyers of color would be a welcome strategy.
Leslie, the last word before I go to the next question.
I think we covered it. I would love the opportunity to share a little bit about Madison Park's work if that fits into the questions. Thanks.
Why don't you share a little bit about Madison Park's work before I get to my last question?
Sure. Thank you so much for that. So Madison Park for the last 3 years has been really focused on the racial homeownership gap. And I just wanted to share some of the strategies that we've been deploying to address that. One of them is to target down payment assistance to our existing residents. And that is a really excellent proxy for people of color because our residents are over 90% people of color. And so we just enhanced a pilot program to offer up to $100,000 for any resident that wants to buy a home in the city of Boston. $50,000 if you want to buy outside the city of Boston, because let's face it, the bank of dad didn't tell you where you had to live, and neither should we. So we're not going to do that. Married to that is one-on-one technical assistance and coaching. In addition to that, we're proud to be part of a CDC collaborative in the city of Boston that's expanding the family self-sufficiency program into Section 8 properties where people are tenants. And we all know when your income goes up, so does your rent. The family self-sufficiency program allows people to escrow that into savings, and Madison Park is actually going to match our residents that participate 4-to-1. I love the family self-sufficiency program because if you don't want to be a home buyer, you don't have to, but you still have savings and you're on that path to savings and asset building. And the other thing, speaking to what Chrystal mentioned, that we're really focused on is developing a robust pipeline of producing homeownership opportunities, preferably, I don't want to say affordable, I'm going to say regulated, because everybody's going to say affordable to who, and I don't want to answer that, right? But we are being extraordinarily aggressive in investing our resources in doing that. And, you know, I'm going to speak for a lot of affordable housing developers. It's not a business line where we make money, right? But we still have to do it. And so those are the three-pronged strategies that we're really, really focused on and attempting to address racial disparities in homeownership and wealth. And we can't wait for Henry to help us figure out how to give Black people preference, because we will be so excited to do that when the opportunity presents itself.
Yeah, I don't want Henry to figure out how to give Black people preference. The reason I like Henry's language, it's a remedy, right? And so we talk a lot about fair housing as an obstacle, and we don't dig enough into what the law allows us to do. It anticipated the idea that we were going to need to do things to remedy past wrongs. And I really want to encourage the fair housing, community to start to think about that, as opposed to what are the proxies we can use for the fact that we have a 2-to-1 homeownership gap, racial homeownership gap in Massachusetts. It's like, I don't want a proxy. Why can't we just go at the issue? Because as Henry described, we know how to do this, right? We know how to build middle-class wealth. We did it.
So this call,
let's do it again.
so before I get to my last question or observation for you to comment on, this last point, Chrystal, calls for a bigger discussion, because that issue has a lot of nuances and complexities to it. I, as a strong advocate for fair housing, do not see a contradiction at all in building more homes and doing it within the context of fair housing. But we don't have time to pursue this discussion, this friendly discussion today. What I want to leave you with, however, and just to get your quick comments, I do understand that when we look at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston study on net worth, Black individuals are quoted as being $8 compared to $247,000. But in the Black community, according to the American Community Survey 215-219 census, the aggregate Black house income in Boston was $4 billion. In Mattapan, where 80% of the population are Black, projected that they're going to have consumer expenditures of $650 million by the year 2023. Mind you, this is before COVID-19. And so we have these two narratives, or maybe it's just one narrative: $8 personal wealth, $4 billion Black community wealth. Is that a discussion that should be part of how do we build the home ownership rate in Boston? Or maybe it's two different discussions. And what I'm suggesting here is that perhaps we need to do exactly what Henry stated. We need to use the same tools that government used to create white wealth. And it was race-based, but it was also place-based. And so redlining, in other words. So do we need to think about more place-based strategies to take advantage of potential enormous economic assets in the Black community? And that'll be, and I'm looking at the time so everyone has an opportunity to comment, and then I'll turn it over back to CHAPA.
Well, maybe I'll take a run at this. This, I think, Dr. Jennings, this actually kind of connects to the question that you asked at the beginning of the panel, which is, what are the present day circumstances? Because if you look at the way homeownership is structured right now, and the way credit flows in the homeownership, if you look at that through a racial lens in a place like Roxbury, just taking an example, here's what you see, right? When there is credit made available, it is typical to households of color and communities of color. It is typically more expensive, and the underwriting is more stringent and difficult than conventional mortgage lending. And so people of color are locked out of are locked out of the conventional mortgage market. When they get credit, it's from alternative markets or second tier markets. And when they get credit, it's more expensive. And that's a pattern that's persisted over many years and is reflected in the present time data. So I would argue that at minimum, one of the things that has to happen, if what you're interested in, if what your assertion is that there's ought to be enough income to leverage ownership, then I would say to you that it's absolutely essential to remove those conditions of discrimination that exist in the credit market, so that households of color that live in places like Roxbury and Mattapan have the same kind of access to the kind of credit that exists in West Roxbury or exists in Newton or in Brookline or in places like that, because that's not happening now. So I'll stop there, but that's at least one, the connection of existing conditions of actual fair lending violations to this problem should not be minimized.
Yeah,
You have the last word, unless someone else wants to have the last word.
I agree with Henry, and I think that it's partly the products that are being used. The FHA loan is a very accessible loan. It's heavily utilized by a lot of first-time homebuyers across the country, but it is more expensive, and it is highly disproportionately served towards Black and Latinx households. The cost of that loan over many years of homeownership is going to lead to loss of opportunity. It's money spent on mortgage insurance premiums and upfront premiums and higher rates that could be spent on other things. I think it also, this question leads me to think about the disparities in where people are buying. Again, the mortgage lending report put together by MCBC highlights the fact that nearly half of all Black home purchases and Latinx home purchases are concentrated in between 5 and 7 cities across the state. Those, limiting opportunity in that way, in 130 communities didn't have a single loan made to a Black or Latinx household. And we know that as robust as our housing market is, wealth, is being accumulated at such high rates in a lot of places. A lot of Black and Latinx households are being left out of that by, the segregation that exists, especially in the greater Boston area and in the home purchase market.